Little Grey Rabbit Goes to the Sea by Alison Uttley. Of course, you must understand that Grey Rabbit's home had no electric light or gas, and even the candles were made from pith of rushes dipped in wax from the wild bees' nests which Squirrel found. Water there was in plenty, but it did not come from a tap. It flowed from a spring outside, which rose up from the ground and went to a brook. Grey Rabbit cooked on a fire, but it was a wood fire. There was no coal in that part of the country. Tea did not come from India, but from a little herb known very well to country people, who once dried it and used it in their cottage homes. Bread was baked from wheat ears ground fine, and Hare and Grey Rabbit gleaned in the cornfields to get the wheat. The doormats were plaited rushes, like country-made mats, and cushions were stuffed with wool gathered from the hedges where sheep pushed through the thorns. As for the looking-glass, Grey Rabbit found the glass dropped from a lady's handbag, and Mole made a frame for it. Usually, the animals gazed at themselves in the still pools, as so many country children have done. The country ways of Grey Rabbit were the country ways known to the author. Squirrel had a cold, Hare had a cough, and Grey Rabbit had the sneezes. It was all because Hare lost the key of the house one rainy night. Grey Rabbit went to visit Mrs. Hedgehog, and Squirrel was left at home with Hare to take care of the house. "Let's go out too, Squirrel," pleaded Hare. "There are moon shadows and mushrooms and mouldywarps all over the place. We shall get home before Grey Rabbit." "Lock the door and take the key," said Squirrel, and she slipped a shawl over her head. They ran away together, skipping under the cloudy sky, dancing in the fairy circles. But the rain came down, and Squirrel and Hare had to shelter in the bushes. Squirrel's tail was soaked, and Hare's fur was bedraggled. They were both wet and shivering. When they got home, Grey Rabbit was crouching on the doorstep waiting for them. "Achoo!" said she. "Achoo!" replied Hare and Squirrel. "I think I've got a cold," said Grey Rabbit. "Achoo!" "I've got a cold," said Squirrel hastily. "Achoo!" "I've got two colds," boasted Hare. "Achoo! Achoo!" "Where's the key?" asked Grey Rabbit. Hare felt in his pockets. He looked under a stone. He picked up the doormat, but there was nothing. They all hunted in the pouring rain, and at last Grey Rabbit found the little key by the garden gate. How wet they were! Grey Rabbit made gruel, and they drank it before they went to bed. But next morning, they all had sore throats and bad colds. "My missus will come over and look after you," said the milkman Hedgehog, when Grey Rabbit sneezed on the doorstep. "Do go back to bed, Miss Grey Rabbit." So they all stayed in bed, and Mrs. Hedgehog came to nurse the family. They drank coltsfoot tea, and their throats were bandaged with flannel leaves, which are the soft leaves of yellow mullein. They sucked butterscotch, and sipped blackcurrant tea and primrose wine. Mrs. Hedgehog bustled about, running upstairs with fresh butter mixed with honey. Little Fuzzy Peg came with a bucket of soup. Mole sent a bunch of fragrant wild thyme. Water Rat brought a pot of water lily jam, and Speckledy Hen sent 3 eggs. But Hare coughed and banged on the floor for more butterscotch. "What they want is a change of air," muttered poor Mrs. Hedgehog, as she trotted about, hurrying home to look after little Fuzzy Peg, and then hurrying back to the 3 invalids. Mouldywarp agreed with her. "Come and stay underground with me," he invited them.
You need a change of air. Nice, dark, damp house.
"Oh, no!" cried Squirrel. "I could not bear to be down a hole."
Your house is too stuffy,"
added Hare rudely. Mouldiwarp was offended, but Grey Rabbit soothed him. "Dear Mouldiwarp," said she, "your house is very nice, but we are used to sunshine."
"Change of air,"
advised Water Rat.
"Come and live on the river and swim every day with me."
"Oh, no!" shivered Squirrel. "Too wet." Wise Owl flew over one night and heard the sneezes.
"What's all this a-tissuing?" he asked. "Squirrel, Hare and Grey Rabbit all got colds? They ought to have a day at the sea."
Nobody answered, but the little animals were listening.
"Too-wit, too-wee, the beautiful sea,"
hooted Wise Owl, and he flew away.
"What is the sea?" asked Hare the next day. "I heard Wise Owl talking about it."
Squirrel and Grey Rabbit were not sure, but Fuzzy Peg knew, for he went to school.
"It's water, lots of water,"
said he.
"The sea, salt."
"I don't like water,"
grumbled Hare.
"First it's rain, and then river, and now sea. I don't like salt either."
Grey Rabbit put on her cloak that evening and went to ask Wise Owl about colds and sneezes.
"A day at the sea,"
advised Wise Owl, yawning, and he flew down to accept Grey Rabbit's gift of a lardy cake. "Where is the sea?" asked Grey Rabbit, but Wise Owl flew back to his bedroom, chuckling and hooting.
"You'll get rid of your sneezes when you feel the sea breezes. Too-wit, too-wee, the beautiful sea."
"Silly old owl!" exclaimed Squirrel, sneezing again.
Achoo!
"Riddle me reeses, Wise Owl and his sneezes,"
grumbled Hare. Mouldiwarp was more helpful when Grey Rabbit asked his advice.
"There's a blue caravan on the common," said he. "It belongs to a brown horse called Duke. Duke will take you to the sea." But who will drive?"
asked Hare anxiously.
"Can't you drive a horse, Hare?"
asked Mole.
"It's easy. Hold the reins and sing out, 'Gee up, Duke.' He knows the way. He often goes with a gypsy man who sells brushes to the fishermen."
Hare wasn't sure of his driving powers, so he ran to all his special friends to invite them to go to the sea in a caravan. Mr. and Mrs. Hedgehog accepted at once, and Fuzzy Peg clapped his paws. Water Rat said he would be delighted, and even the Mole and the Speckledy Hen decided to go with the party. So everybody got ready. Squirrel made a little tent, and Grey Rabbit packed a hamper of food. Hare fetched the garden spade and the little bucket which had held Fuzzy Peg's soup. Mouldiwarp put a golden guinea in his pocket for,
"It may come in useful,"
said he. The next morning, as soon as the sun rose and the birds were singing their hymns, the three little animals set off, dressed in their Sunday clothes. They locked the door and hid the key under a stone.
Achoo! Achoo! Achoo!
They sneezed as they ran over the fields to the common. The Hedgehog family waited by the caravan, with Water Rat and the Speckledy Hen and Mouldiwarp.
"All drivers,"
explained Hare. The old horse showed them the key, and they unlocked the door of the caravan. While they scrambled inside, he backed between the shafts and waited. Hare clambered on Duke's back and fastened the traces, and Squirrel hung a branch of nut leaves over the horse's head to keep the flies away. Then, with Hare and Mouldiwarp and Squirrel on the front seat, and the rest of the animals inside, they started.
"Gee up!"
cried Hare, shaking the reins.
"You needn't bother to say that,"
said the horse, turning his head.
"I know my way. We shall be there all in good time if you mind your own business and don't attract attention."
Hare was disappointed, but he huddled under the rug and was silent. Mouldiwarp stared at the sky, and Squirrel's bright eyes gazed about at the fields and trees. Inside the caravan, Grey Rabbit, with the Hedgehog family, Water Rat and Speckledy Hen, explored. They jumped on the bed and looked in the mirror and tasted the cheese on a shelf. Grey Rabbit made a cup of tea, and they ate a few crumbs of biscuit. The caravan went through villages, past farms and cottages, down leafy lanes in the quiet dawn. The horse chose the byways where they met nobody except a few wandering animals. There was Brush the hedgehog, camping by the road, and a fox who gave a sidelong look at the brown horse. But he did not notice Hare, Mouldiwarp and Squirrel peeping from the rug. After a time, every animal fell asleep, rocked by the motion of the swinging caravan. The old horse jogged along peacefully, for he knew every step of the way. He came at last to a lane which led to the grassy top of the cliffs, and at the end of this green path he stopped.
Here we are, he neighed. Get out, all of you.
Hare sneezed and tumbled off his seat down to the grass, and with him fell Squirrel and Mole, who were wrapped in the rug.
The sea! The glorious sea!
Shouted Hare, dancing to the door of the caravan. Grey Rabbit and the others hurried out, laughing and cheering as they saw the wide green sea, with the little snowy waves curling in the distance. "It's like a green cornfield with rows of daisies in it," said Grey Rabbit.
It's a windy wheat field!
Cried Hare. Their fur was ruffled, and Speckledy Hen's bonnet was nearly blown away in the wind.
Unharness me,
said Duke, turning his head.
I always wait here while my master goes to the village, but there's a sandy cove below the cliffs. Go and enjoy yourselves, and come back when the sun goes down to bathe.
Hare and Squirrel unbuckled the harness, and Duke began to graze on the short, sweet turf.
Don't be late,
called the horse, as they collected their belongings and ran down the narrow track to the sea. There was sea pinks, and many a flower Grey Rabbit had not seen before. Mouldiwarp gathered some sea lavender to make herb tea when he got home, and the Speckledy Hen tasted some salty worms. When they reached the bottom, after a struggle with Mrs. Hedgehog, who stuck fast in a gorse bush, and Fuzzy Peg, who tumbled down a crack in the rocks, they all gave little shrieks of joy. They felt the warm sand under their feet and the strong sea air in their fur and feathers. They stood looking at the vast stretch of water, and they saw the little curling waves, each edged with white lace, like Grey Rabbit's best petticoat. Mr. and Mrs. Hedgehog said they were too old for the sea, and they rested in the shelter of the tent. The Speckledy Hen didn't care for the breeze. She sat on a round white pebble and tried to hatch it.
What does the sea talk about?
Asked Fuzzy Peg, holding tight to Grey Rabbit's hand. He was rather frightened by the little waves that rolled up to his feet. Sea breezes, no more of your sneezes, whispered the sea. Hare picked up a strand of seaweed, but the waves came up and washed his feet. With a wild cry, he ran away.
Oh!
But when he looked round, the sea also had turned back.
It keeps coming and going,
said he, puzzled. There were several strangers on the narrow strip of beach. A flock of snowy seagulls walked on the sand and then swam in the water, bobbing in the waves. Their eyes were so fierce, Grey Rabbit and her friends felt rather nervous. A group of oyster catchers wearing pale pink stockings played on the beach. A big black cormorant sat fishing from a rock. Water Rat was glad he was not fishing in the same place. The screams of the gulls filled the air, and there was never a thrush to sing a sweet song, but always the sea chanted its own beautiful music. Grey Rabbit, Grey Rabbit, sang the little curling waves as they lapped at Grey Rabbit's soft little feet and touched her grey dress. The sea wind blew her apron like a sail and tugged at her petticoat. It pulled Hare's red coat and ruffled Squirrel's tail. It blew Mrs. Hedgehog's prickles and nipped Mr. Hedgehog's nose and tossed Fuzzy Peg's smock over his head. Then it tried to grab Water Rat's ruffles, and it fluttered Mrs. Speckledy Hen's feathers so that she had to leave her white stone egg and hide in the rocks for a time. Wise Owl said the sea would take our tissues away, but I'm going to sneeze, announced Grey Rabbit. Hare and Squirrel both wrinkled up their noses as they felt a sneeze coming. Achoo! 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 They all sneezed together. They made such a noise that even the seagulls were startled, and they flew away. The pretty oyster catchers ran swiftly on their toes, and the dark cormorant dived into the sea. The breeze caught those sneezes and tossed them up in the air. They floated away like baby clouds in the blue sky. "My tissue has gone," cried Grey Rabbit. "I'm quite well. Hooray!" "Mine's gone too," added Squirrel. "Hooray! Both my tissues have flown away," laughed Hare, and the three animals danced on the sand, waving their paws. Then Grey Rabbit lifted up her grey skirt and paddled in the sea. Fuzzy Peg joined her. He was so small, a wave might have upset him, so he held tight to her apron. Water Rat took off his velvet coat and white ruffles and swam in the shallow water. Hare plucked up his courage, took off his red coat and rushed into the sea, and then out again as he saw a wave coming. Squirrel, with a cockleshell tied on her head for a hat and a garland of seaweed round her neck, began to dance on the edge of the sea. And Mouldiwarp dug a tunnel and made a mole heap. Suddenly, there was a shout from the hedgehogs who sat in the tent watching.
Hey!
The Speckledy Hen cackled from her nest of pebbles. "Thief! Robber! Bandit!" they called. A seagull flew away with Hare's red coat, and a second gull took Water Rat's frills. The birds flew to a rocky part of the cliff where they dropped their treasures by their nests with loud squawks to their wives and babies. "Ah! Fine bed covers!" they cried. The group of little animals on the beach could see the red coat and white ruffles hanging far above them on the wild rocky cliff. "Who is going to get them back?" asked Hare, dancing with rage. "Those seagulls are varmints! They are foxes! They are weasels!" "I'll go," said Grey Rabbit. "And I," added Squirrel. "Then I'll go and take care of you," said Hare gallantly. Water Rat and Mouldiwarp had to stay to look after Mr. and Mrs. Hedgehog, Fuzzy Peg, and the Speckledy Hen, who were all rather frightened of the fierce screaming gulls who came swooping near. So the three little animals climbed the high, dangerous rocks, and Squirrel, on her nimble feet, was always the first. She swung up on the gorse bushes and skipped over the cracks. Hare leapt up and down, rushing forward and then stopping in alarm. Grey Rabbit plodded silently along behind them. Squirrel arrived first at the ledge where the seagulls' nests lay. Little grey gulls were toddling about, but when Squirrel came near, the mother gulls pecked fiercely at her head. Luckily, Squirrel wore the cockleshell hat she had picked up on the beach, and this protected her. "Oh! Oh!" screamed the gulls. "You have a very hard head." "I want Hare's coat and Water Rat's frills," said Squirrel, trembling with fright. Then Hare's head popped round the corner, and Grey Rabbit's startled little face appeared. The gulls swooped at them, but Grey Rabbit shook her apron in their faces, and Hare gave a queer, shrill cry, remarkably like Wise Owl's call. "To-wit, to-wee, the horrible sea!" he hooted, and he threw all the pebbles in his waistcoat pocket at the birds. The noise frightened the gulls away for a moment, and the three seized the red coat and the torn snowy frills and ran off, tumbling, rolling, tearing their fur, scratching their legs as they fell down the cliff to their friends at the bottom.
Never make friends with a wild seagull,
said Fuzzy Peg solemnly. Hare put on his coat and brushed himself. Squirrel combed her tail. Grey Rabbit pulled thorns from her fur and bathed her cut feet.
"Did you hear what I said to those gulls?"
asked Hare.
"I frightened them away. I pretended I was Wise Owl."
Mrs. Hedgehog lighted a fire of driftwood, and they filled the kettle from a stream that ran down the rocks. Then, with the bright fire crackling and the good tea brewing and the food spread out, they enjoyed the picnic and forgot their troubles. Mr. Hedgehog emptied his pail of milk into their small mugs, and Grey Rabbit poured out the tea.
"Now for a sand pie,"
said Hare when all the food was eaten.
"Who wants a sand pie?"
He filled his bucket with sand, and the rest watched, for Hare was sometimes very clever at doing things. He patted the top firm and turned it upside down. He looked round at his audience, and then he slowly lifted the bucket. There was a lovely golden pie, as nice to look at as Grey Rabbit's sponge pudding. "Oh!" cried little Fuzzy Peg, and Mrs. Hedgehog opened her eyes wide in surprise. They all had a taste, but nobody liked it very much. Even the speckledy hen said it ought to have one of her eggs in it. But Hare was so proud of his first pie, he made another and another until he had a ring of them. Squirrel put a cockleshell on each turret, Grey Rabbit draped seaweed about them, and little Fuzzy Peg found pebbles to adorn them. Hare leapt over them, and Fuzzy Peg followed, crying,
"Follow my leader!"
But nobody could jump high like Hare. They wandered along the sandy strip, for the gulls had flown away, and all was quiet except for the music of the waves. They found beautiful pebbles and pearly shells. Grey Rabbit picked up a starfish, and Squirrel found a mermaid's purse. Hare found a long razor shell. Fuzzy Peg gathered a lot of seaweed balloons, and Water Rat discovered a sea urchin, prickly as Mr. Hedgehog himself. So the happy day passed, and the sun moved down to the sea to bathe in a flood of gold. "What time is it, Hare?" asked Grey Rabbit. Hare looked at his watch. The fingers pointed as usual to 12 o'clock. The watch had not kept time since Hare once stirred his tea with it. He dipped the watch in the sea and listened. "Tick, tack, time to go back," said the fat little watch, and the fingers began to move again.
"The sea has cured my watch too!"
cried Hare. They put the starfish in the bucket, which they half filled with water so that the tide would not flow over the edge. They twined seaweed round their necks and stuffed their pockets with striped pebbles. Then, waving goodbye to the sea, they wandered wearily up the steep, narrow track.
"Hurry up!"
cried Duke, who was expecting them.
"The sun is getting into the sea!"
Far away, they saw a golden track on the water, like a pathway in the waves.
"That's the road to the stars,"
said Mouldiwarp happily. Grey Rabbit wished she could run along it and explore, but Hare said,
"We want the road home."
He fastened the horse's traces and clambered inside the caravan. Everyone got into the bed, and nobody bothered to drive. The horse jogged along the lanes, and the first stars pricked the evening sky. Seagulls wailed as they rumbled along, but soon the gulls were left behind, and the owls called to them. Inside the caravan, all was quiet, for every little animal was fast asleep. They reached the common at midnight without any more adventures, and, yawning, they tumbled out on the grass. Grey Rabbit locked the door, and Hare unharnessed the horse. The gypsy lay under a bush wrapped in a coat, snoring. So after whispering their thanks to Duke, they all hurried away. The speckledy hen flew over the fields, in a fright lest the fox should see her. Mouldiwarp went underground to his home. Water Rat ran swiftly to the river. Mr. and Mrs. Hedgehog, with a sleepy little Fuzzy Peg clutching his bucket and starfish, went slowly to the cottage. Squirrel, Hare, and Little Grey Rabbit ran along the field paths, with many a backward look. They found their key and entered the house and went to bed. "Sea breezes, murmured Grey Rabbit as she curled up under the blanket. "I like the sea breezes." In the morning, the gypsy opened his eyes and stared at the caravan. He unlocked the door and looked suspiciously around. A necklace of seaweed hung from a hook. A heap of shells lay on the rumpled bed. Little footprints were everywhere. In a mug was a golden guinea. "Real gold," said he, biting it. "Now, I wonder who took this caravan." Duke never said a word. He went on nibbling the grass and laughing softly to himself over the adventure.